Hey guys, so what are we going to call these videos? Workshop chat videos? These spontaneous videos that are unplanned, that happen late at night for some strange reason, unexpectedly. This video is going to go on the How to Do Stuff in Japan playlist. It's a heads up video for people who might have a relationship with Japanese person or Japanese people, and it also might be of interest just to people who are interested in Japanese culture. Maybe. We shall see, shan't we? So, what triggered this video was, I'm a member of a flying club, and if I save up a few yen, occasionally I can go for a fly. I can rent our club aeroplane and go for a fly. So I'd saved up a few yen, enough for 30 minutes of flying, and I hadn't flown for a while, so I went out and jumped in the aeroplane and just did some touch and goes just to keep me current. So just round and round and round for 30 minutes, and then parked up the aeroplane. And someone else had used the aeroplane yesterday, so the fuel was down a bit. So just as a matter of courtesy for the people that will be flying tomorrow, I called the fuel truck and refueled the aeroplane. So this is all just detail, but I'll get to the point in a second. So when the refueling truck turned up, he said, you know, where do you want me to fill it to? Because sometimes if you're going to be travelling with cargo and passengers, you don't want to fill the aeroplane to full because you'll be overweight. But in this case, it seemed like a good idea to fill it to full. So I filled it to full, which is just right up to the top, basically. And so anyway, that was all good. I came home and got an email just a little while ago from an old guy that I fly with sometimes, and we get on pretty well, and he's a nice man, and we have sort of a connection. We fly a bit together occasionally, and but there's a flying club leader, one of the leaders of the flying club, who's actually a pilot examiner, and we get on pretty well too. And he examines me. We do a flight together every couple of years, and he checks me out, and we get on really, really well. So I get an email, and this examiner guy lives near the airport, and he checks on the airplane all the time, and he watches us flying around, right? So I got an email, and it said that he'd been watching me flying around. So I got an email from my associate guy in the club, right? This sort of a friend who said that this pilot examiner in the club had contacted him and said he'd watching me flying around, and he went and checked the airplane, and that it was full to the top, and because the airplane's a bit old and the undercarriage is dodgy, please don't fill it to the top. There's these little tabs inside. You can fill it to a lower level, which is like 80% full. And to keep the weight down so it doesn't stress the old undercarriage, could we just not fill it to the top, just fill it to 80%, which is quite reasonable. Bit of a waste of time perhaps, but quite a reasonable request, and it seems to be a new policy that they've come up with to sort of lighten the load on the undercarriage a bit by not filling it to the top. So that's fair enough, right? It's all good. But, and so as far as they're concerned, that's all normal. The flying club pilot examiner guy asked the guy who's, because he'd see it that guy's like my friend, right? So he asks my friend, who they'd probably consider to be my senpai, right? My senior friend, because he brought me into the club. So he's sort of responsible for me. So this guy asked him to ask me to fill the thing, only fill the thing 80%, right? So from their point of view, that's a perfectly normal way to go about it. That rather than that pilot examiner guy sending me an email and saying, please only fill it 80%, that he contacts this other guy who's sort of like my senior friend and asks him to ask me. So from a Japanese point of view, that's a very normal thing to do, right? But as a non-Japanese person, seeing as I have a connection with this pilot examiner guy, I obviously would have preferred him just to send me an email, you know, rather than bother the other guy and ask him to do it, you know what I mean? So some of you will come from cultures where you'll understand what I'm saying. Here's another example, and some of you might remember this from years ago. This is a very old story from probably 12 years ago or more. And there was a guy that I used to do some things with. We did Kyudo together, Japanese archery, and we did some kart racing together, and we went hang gliding once, or what do you call it, the parachute thing, jumping off mountains with a parachute thing. And we used to hang out a bit, and he was a pretty cool dude. He was a fairly active sort of guy, and he's a fairly interesting sort of dude. And we hung out a bit, and we used to drink a bit, and we used to hang out a bit until I got married. And then, after I got married, I sort of was busy doing other things, and then we had babies and stuff, so I didn't spend as much time with him anymore, right? And I don't know where to start with this one. So he decided that I didn't want to hang out with him anymore. And see, because Japanese dudes don't really understand that. Most Japanese dudes don't understand that wanting to spend time with the family and the kids thing, right? So he didn't understand. He had kids too. He was married as well, and he had kids as well, but he was a party dude. He was a bit of a playboy, actually. So he was a bit disappointed that we weren't hanging out so much, right? Now, in some of our cultures, if he'd sent me an email and said to me, hey, I haven't seen you for a while, let's go and have a beer, I would have gone, right? And, hey, yeah, haven't seen you for a long time, let's go and have a beer, let's do that. And I would have done it. But he didn't do that. What he did, and this is a Japanese thing again, right? There was another guy that he knew that he went to school with, who is also sort of a buddy of mine, and he's my accountant, right? And these are all Japanese people, right? Everybody in the story is Japanese except me. So this dude, who I'd hung out with quite a lot, instead of sending me an email and saying, hey, haven't seen you for a long time, let's go have a beer, instead of that, he actually called, I think he actually phoned this dude who is my accountant and sort of a buddy too, and who I see reasonably regularly, and he called him and said to him, I used to see the Aussie dude all the time, and then since he got married I don't see him anymore. And he sort of put it from a point of view of I had obligation to him, because he used to sort of help me out when I first got to Japan. He used to help me out with things, and that for years we sort of did things together, and then now we weren't doing stuff anymore. So he's rung this other guy and said, I'm not seeing the Aussie dude anymore, can you talk to him about it? And then that guy, instead of that guy just calling me and, hey, I just had this weird call, this dude, instead of him doing that, he told his wife. And then his wife knows my wife. So she's called my wife and said, I need to talk to you, can we meet? And at the time, my wife was actually really heavily pregnant, right? And she'd been told to stay home and take it easy. And so she thought, something's going on here, I better go. And she went and met her at a family restaurant. And this woman said, your husband used to hang out with this guy, and this guy helped him out a bit, and so he sort of got obligation to him, and now he's not seeing him anymore. Right? So for some of us, in some of our cultures, it's like, what? This guy used to hang out with you, he's not hanging out with you anymore. Why don't you say, why doesn't he just send me an email and say, haven't seen you for a long time, let's have a beer, and I would have. Right? But instead of that, he calls this other dude, and then instead of that dude calling me and telling me, that dude tells his wife, and then his wife goes and meets my wife and stresses her out, and then my wife comes and tells me, right? And for all of those people involved in that ridiculous situation, all of them thought that was normal, because in Japanese society, everybody has a position sort of higher or lower than everybody else, right? And there's this senpai kohai thing, and there's this sort of and the way they see it is that roundabout way of doing it is less confrontational, right? So this is the point of this video, is for one thing, is for people that are mildly interested in Japanese culture. It's just sort of another aspect of Japanese culture. But for any of you that might have relationships with Japanese people, because when this happens, it's partly mystifying and partly really annoying and partly sort of insulting. I mean, in some of our cultures, in Australian culture, if a dude did what that guy did today, you'd be going, what's wrong with you, man? If you want to tell me something, tell me to my face. That's what we say, don't we? You know, tell me to my face. I mean, in this case, sending an email would have been adequate. He didn't really need to tell me to my face. But in some of our cultures, we're like, well, if you got something to say to me, say it to me. Don't go to this other guy and get this other guy to tell me. I mean, it's in most of our cultures, and a lot of our cultures, that would just be a really weak. I mean, that's the feeling I get when they do stuff like that. And I mean, that's only two examples, but it happens all the time. It happens all the time. Quite often, what will happen to me is that dudes will tell my wife. People will tell my wife stuff to tell me, because it's sort of this roundabout way of doing it. And it's not just because I'm a foreigner either, by the way, because I also see where someone will have something to say to my wife, and instead of telling her, they'll tell someone else that she's associated with, who'll tell her. And she sees that as perfectly normal, because they see it as a soft way to do things. That if this pilot examiner guy had sent me a message directly and said, hey, listen, would you mind just not filling the tanks to full because we want to keep the load down on the undercarriage, he would see that as being more confrontational and potentially more uncomfortable for me. So he would see it as a softer way to do it, is to go around this roundabout way to sort of ask this other guy to gently tell me, as sort of a softer way to do it, right? Sort of like when when you're a kid and someone wants to break up with someone, but instead of telling them, they tell their friend to tell him he's dropped. Tell her I don't want to go out with her anymore, sort of like that. And so for people that come from a different culture, it feels like they're being weak. It feels like they're being weak. It feels like they're going backdoor. The first reaction, even though this is a cultural thing, when it happens, like, I've got a relationship. That pilot examiner dude's actually quite a cool dude. We've actually flown together quite a bit in the past, and he's a pretty cool dude, and we get on really well. So when I got that email, I was like, man, why doesn't he send me an email? That was my feeling. Because it doesn't matter, it's all very well sitting in the workshop talking about this. It's all very well to intellectually understand that these things are cultural differences, but when they actually happen to you, it's really hard sometimes. It's like, come on, tell me to my face, or just tell me directly. This roundabout, and from our point of view, unnecessarily involving that other dude, because none of these people in this story are really that close to me anyway. I mean, except for my wife, because, there's probably a topic for another video, but you don't really have close friends in Japan, partly because of this. You'll hear people say sometimes, foreign people living in Japan, non-Japanese people living in Japan will sometimes say, I've got lots of Japanese friends. And whenever I hear that, I just let it slide. But what my thinking is, no, you don't. No, you don't. Because of cultural stuff like this, it is really hard to feel connected to people here. Because all this weird shit that they do, they consider it to be normal. So these dudes, I'd call them associates. Everybody in this story, except for my wife, are associates. I wouldn't really call any of them friends. Sometimes I do when I'm explaining stuff like this to give it something sort of, to give you some sort of idea what I'm talking about. But the reality is they're not really. The guy that I fly with sometimes, he's a fellow member of the flying club, and he's a decent man, he's a good man, and so is that pilot examiner guy, he's a good guy too. And, I like both those dudes, they're both good dudes, but they're not friends, because we don't have any common ground when it comes to life, Common ground is the flying. And both those dudes I relate to really well when we fly, and happy to go flying with them and have a great time flying with them. But that's the end of it, because, there's no other connection, because their thinking about so many things is so different from our thinking. That might be a topic for another workshop video sometime, is that, you don't have Japanese friends. It depends on what you consider to be a friend, but because of stuff like this, you don't have the same thinking about so many important things, and they wouldn't get it. There's no point in me trying to explain to any of the people in that story, except my wife, any of the people in these stories, trying to explain to them, hey, listen, if you got something to say to me, I'd feel better if you came directly to me. I can't say that. because they wouldn't get it, and that'd make them uncomfortable. Because in their culture, you know, for that Pilot Examiner guy to send me an email today and say, hey, listen, you know, tell me about the fuel thing, he would see that as being too confrontational and potentially make me too uncomfortable. So from his point of view, he was probably being considerate to me by doing this backdoor way of doing it so that I wouldn't feel uncomfortable, which in their culture would be true, but in my culture it's not. In my culture it made me feel quite uncomfortable. It was like, my thinking is intellectually, Japanese culture. My feeling is, you weak prick, you know? You weak prick. If you got something to say, just tell me. Don't go bothering that other guy and getting him to contact me. You know, that's my feeling, right? And that's why I'm making this video. That's why I'm making this video, is that it doesn't matter how much you understand these cultural differences intellectually, sometimes when they happen to you, they can make you feel disappointed in these people, and they can make you feel frustrated and all sorts of stuff. Because like, oh, come on, you know, just tell me. You know, the other story about the dude, you know, a grown man who I used to spend quite a bit of time with, you know, wants to know why I haven't been hanging out with him anymore. And instead of just sending me a message and saying, haven't seen you for a long time, let's have a beer, to which I would have said, sure, what day's good for you, right? Because he was an entertaining dude. And again, not a real friend, I wouldn't call him a friend, but he was all right to hang out with. You know, we had some good laughs and did some good things. So if he'd sent me an email and said to me, haven't seen you for a long time, let's have a beer, I would have said, yeah, sure, when's good for you? But instead of doing that, which is what we sort of, in some of our cultures, that's what two men would do. That's the way two men would communicate with each other. Instead of doing that, he goes to the other dude, and oh, he hasn't been hanging out with me anymore. And instead of that dude contacting me and saying, hey, what's going on with this guy, which is what would happen in some of our cultures, instead of doing that, so the first dude, instead of contacting me directly, talks to the other dude, and instead of him contacting me directly, speaks to his wife, and then she speaks to my wife, and then my wife speaks to me. And it caused us a lot of hassle, actually, because, you know, she was actually heavily pregnant at the time. The doctor had said, take it easy, and here she is going off to meet this woman at a family restaurant, and this stuff stressed her out, because the way it was put to her is like, you know, this guy, you know, he's neglecting his friend. And again, they'd probably see him as some sort of senpai. He actually helped me out a bit when I first came to Japan, years before that. So, incidentally, just to balance it out, he also went and had a week in Australia, which I organised for him as well, made all his bookings and organised for him to go flying in Cairns and organised for him to go scuba diving. And I actually spent a lot of time acting like a travel agent organising his holiday. So, you know, he sort of made out that I had some sort of obligation to him, which again, that's, I mean, giri, they call it, obligation, and it's a huge thing in Japanese culture. And, you know, that's another thing. If they think that you owe them, or they think you owe somebody something, then that's another thing they'll do. They'll go through this process of tell him that he's got obligation to that person. You know, it does your head in, it really does. It really does. It's like, come on, just talk to me direct. You know, just talk to me direct about this. Needless to say, I mean, I lost all interest in that dude. After that episode, if he had sent me an email after that and said, let's go and have a beer, I wouldn't have, because it was like, you know, this is why it's very hard to have sincere friendships with Japanese people, because usually their values and their ideas of, you know, what makes a relationship, you know, what makes a friendship, you know, our thinking is friends wouldn't do that. You know, grown men don't ask another man to ask his wife, to ask his wife, to ask him why he's not hanging out with him anymore. I mean, Jesus, you know. Some of you will be getting it. Some of you sitting there going, what? You know, right, exactly, right? But from their point of view, again, see, they're trying to avoid conflict. And then you've got the complication of all this relationship stuff as well. Everybody's above or below everybody else, you know. And I mean, I see it with other people all the time too. You know, and I'll hear my wife involved in these things where, you know, she's in some community group and someone else is not pulling their weight, or there's some sort of problem, And instead of her just contacting that person directly and saying, hey, listen, you really should be doing this, she'll ask the other person's friend to ask her. You know, they do it all the time, all this backdoor, roundabout. And then the way they talk when they're doing this stuff too is really soft. Like the guy that sent me the email today, it's really soft and sort of really dancing around the point. You know, talking about what great weather it was today and how, you know, what a great thing this is and that is and this, and big roundabout sort of way, and then sort of slipping it in at the end. And that's, I hear my wife do it all the time. She'll be on the phone for 30 minutes talking to someone, and in amongst that 30 minutes of just chatter, she'll slip in the important thing that she called to do, but really gently. And then that person goes off then and spends 30 minutes talking to the person that's involved, and they'll do the same thing. They'll have 30 minutes of chatter and gently slip in the main point of the story. So it's just the way they do it. From their point of view, they're trying to avoid conflict, they're trying to avoid making the other person feel uncomfortable. And from their point of view, this roundabout way of doing things is the gentlest way to do it. But it just makes the smallest thing into a big thing. You know, I mean, that guy, if he'd sent a message and said, haven't seen you for a long time, let's have a beer, I would have said, yes, let's do it, and we would have done it. But instead of that simple, and this is the other thing in their society, in their way of doing things, everything's overly complicated. And every little thing becomes a huge thing with lots of talking and lots of faffing and lots of time wasted. You know, and that was a classic example. Instead of 2 short emails, I mean, my Aussie friends would have said, let's have a, haven't seen you for a while, let's have a beer. I would have said, yeah, let's do that. And that would have been the end of it. Whereas, you know, this big roundabout, he talks to him, he talks to her, she talks to her, she talks to me. That was a huge thing, that was. And it was dramas for everybody, that was. But they see that as the correct way to do it. And the same thing for today. Same thing for today. Instead of just sending me a quick email, hey, listen, don't overfill those, or don't fill those tanks. We're only filling them at 80%. Keep the weight off the undercarriage. I would have sent back, yep, no problem. But nope, that's not what they do. So it does your head in. It really does. I mean, there's, you know, those of you who've been watching these videos over the years would have heard lots and lots of things like this. I mean, a lot of videos we've made over the years, people have heard it and said, oh, I couldn't handle that. I couldn't handle that. We've had a lot of videos where people have said that. I couldn't live with that. That drive me crazy. And occasionally, a topic like this, people say, oh, I wouldn't do that. I'd do this. I'd just go straight to them and say, talk to me, you know. Yeah, you can't, because that would make a drama. So if I'd gone straight back to that first guy in that big circle and said to him, you know, you want to be with me? Contact me directly, you weak prick. You know, that wouldn't have worked. And the same thing today, if I contacted that guy in that pilot examiner directly and said, hey, listen, if you want to tell me something, tell me directly, that would have been a big confrontational, uncomfortable thing. So the correct thing for me to do, which I've done, was to send an answer back to that email and say, oh, you know, and I do the same thing too. Yes, it was great weather conditions today for flying, and, you know, big, long, roundabout sort of nonsense sort of email first, you know, with a whole heap of faffing. And then I said, understand about the fuel thing, you know, Roger Wilco, pilot talk, so yeah, I'll do it, you know. And at the end. And so all the other stuff came first, and then that, and then a bit more polite faffing stuff, and then that was the end of the email. So I responded the way I'm supposed to, and then he'll send an email back to the first guy and tell him, sorry, camera died. So he'll send an email back. So I'll send him the email saying all the things I'm supposed to say. I sent an email saying all the things I'm supposed to say. He'll send an email back to the first guy and say, yeah, dude understands, you know, he'll only fill to the tabs, all good. But he'll make that'll be a really long email though, because he'll have to be polite and talk a lot of nonsense as well. It's just a soft, they're so sensitive in their thinking to any sort of conflict or any sort of making waves or making anyone feel uncomfortable. That's their thinking. That's what they think they're doing. They think they're avoiding that. And it's just unfortunate that in our culture, it has the opposite effect. In our culture, what they do makes us crazy. It's like, oh, you know, Jesus, really? Man up and tell me directly. You know, don't do this roundabout sort of backdoor sort of, tell him to tell her to tell him to tell her stuff. Tell me directly, But that's just what they do. So anyway, if you find yourself having relationships with Japanese people and they do that, it is hard. A lot of stuff they do like that is with good intention, and for them it's perfectly normal. And that's sort of the yardstick we have to use. When they do stuff, we have to say, is that normal in Japanese culture? Because the feeling is that guy has a problem. That guy is weak, or that guy, is man up. Our feeling is that person is not doing things the way they should. But the yardstick we have to use is that person's behaviour normal in Japanese culture? And if it is, then we just have to deal with it, and we have to respond in kind. We have to respond the way a Japanese person would respond. Because it doesn't work. There's always someone who watches these videos and goes, "Oh, well, I'm not Japanese, I wouldn't do it that way." Yeah, that happens. And that's why a lot of people who aren't Japanese have a lot of problems here and don't get to do things they want to do. I was invited to join that flying club by the dude who sent me the email today. He was involved in that flying club, and he invited me to meet those other guys, and they invited me into the club because of that guy. And you don't get to do stuff like that in Japan if you don't play the game the way they play it. And that's the key. That's why I make these how-to videos, is as much as it does your head in, and a lot of this stuff leaves you going, "Oh, Jesus," you have to play the game by the rules that they're played by here. And if you do, you get a lot of benefit. There's a lot of people that you'll hear say, "Oh, I've lived in Japan for 100 years and I don't do it their way, I do everything my way, and I've never had a problem." You hear that quite a lot. But the problems that you have here are often not so obvious, or the advantages that you miss out on, you'll never know. And I've said this on previous videos, that if you don't behave the way you're expected to behave here, you might not get invited to that party, and you might not get offered that job, and you might not get invited to join the flying club. They'll be really polite to you and really nice to you, and people say this all the time, "I don't do that, I do what I want to do in Japan, I live like, like my way, I'm not Japanese, I do what I want to do, and I've never had a problem." But they don't know what they're missing out on. They don't know how many times people have gone, "Oh, could we give that dude a job?" "Oh, no," because they won't put their neck out for you if they don't think you're going to behave the way they think is appropriate. If you go head on and approach people directly and, "Hey, you talk to me directly," and do that sort of stuff, they won't introduce you to other people because they don't want to, oh, that's all too much for them. So you've got to play by the game. So I've got to play by the game. I can tell you guys this stuff does my head in, but I don't tell them. I just react the way I'm supposed to react. So that email today, I reacted to it the way I was supposed to, and sent one back in a Japanese style of roundabout, sort of soft sort of salute, answer, telling him, "Yeah, I understand, and I'll do that." And that's it. That's what you got to do, And then in return, that guy knows that I'll play the game the way it's supposed to be played. "Oh, he's a foreigner, but he's okay." That's what he'll say. He's a foreigner, but he's okay. He's all right, because I play the game. That's what you got to do. And this sort of drive you nuts stuff, you got to go sit in the workshop and go, "Jesus," but you can't do it to them. Right, you can't say it to them. So anyway,
more videos coming soon.